On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the first face-to-face in a year. Where do China-U.S. relations go from here? And doing the rounds in Latin America, the Chinese president's state visits to Argentina and Panama. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with a breakthrough, as some see, in mending relations between the world's two largest economies. The planned meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump took place last Saturday on the sidelines of this year's G20. Their candid exchange did bring, as some believe, brighter prospects for China and the U.S. on some fronts.
A big sigh of relief as Chinese and American leaders came out of a meeting with smiles. With the future of globalization at crossroads, the working dinner between President Xi and President Trump had been the most anticipated event at this year's G20 in Buenos Aires. The two leaders hadn't met in person in over a year, and they had a lot to catch up on. In a scene reminiscent of a dinner that symbolized the dawn of the normalization of China-U.S. ties, Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump talked for more than 2.5 hours. The meeting lasted longer than scheduled, and the results were agreements and room for further negotiations. President Xi said China would speed up its reform and opening up and expand imports. Echoing the Chinese president's comments, Mr. Trump called the meeting amazing and productive. He said the U.S. hoped to do more work with China in areas including education, cultural exchange, and law enforcement. As for Taiwan, Mr. Trump said his administration did recognize the One China policy. The two heads of state also discussed the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, with the American president praising China's positive contributions. According to a White House statement, President Xi, in a wonderful humanitarian gesture, also agreed to help America with its drug epidemic. Washington said the two sides would begin negotiations immediately on cybersecurity, services, and agriculture, and the deal was expected to be sorted out within the next 90 days. The most immediate result of the two leaders' talk was the de-escalation of trade tensions. Mr. Trump called off a planned tariff hike on January 1st, and the two sides would step up efforts toward eliminating all other existing tariffs. With China and the U.S. on the same page, the G20 summit also concluded with a joint declaration. And with the next rounds of negotiations between Beijing and Washington, it is a clear indication the two presidents agree cooperation is the best choice.
So what is the big picture on relations between China and the United States after the G20 meeting and especially the bilateral dinner? Meet our panelists in Beijing, Rong Ying, the Vice President of CIIS, the China Institute of International Studies, and also Liu Baocheng, the Dean of Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. In New York, Robert Hormat, Vice Chairman of the Kissinger Associates, and in Washington, D.C., Hong Chuan, who is the Executive Managing Director of the Institute of International Finance. I want to welcome the four of you, gentlemen, for being with us on quite an important day, I would say. Right after the bilateral meeting, there have been so much press coverages about what exactly happened, what's said by both sides, what they have agreed upon or not. Let's talk about some of these points. Mr. Rong, briefly from you. First meeting almost in a year, face to face. How do you see its significance at the end of the day?
Yes, indeed, that's a very significant meeting between the two countries. Certainly, I think between the two presidents for 1 year, particularly as we have seen for the last 10 months and more that the relationship, particularly the trade relationship, trade disputes has, getting worse and worse to the extent that people are speculating that it would run into the relationship, run into a kind of danger, risk of a new Cold War, at least new economic Cold War. So this meeting, the summit meeting, if I can say, between the two leaders, had helped to stop the further deteriorating of the relationship. And also I send a strong and positive signal of the importance that the two leaders has attached and to have a stable relationship and also to manage the differences in a constructive way.
Mr. Hormat, of course, both sides have indicated the importance of the meeting by extending the meeting from 2 hours to 2.5 hours. That's, of course, quite significant if you think about state leaders' schedule during the G20 summit. Having said that, though, what do you think will this, next period of time mean for the bilateral relations?
Well, it provides an important opportunity for both sides to sit down and discuss a number of the substantive issues that have emerged even prior to the Trump administration, but have increased in their intensity, at least from a vocal point of view, over the last year or year and a half. And I do think there is a major and very challenging agenda. There are issues on this agenda that have been discussed for years, and progress has been made, but not definitive solutions. So if you look at the agenda that Washington has talked about, intellectual property, trade secrets, partnership requirements, and things like that, that Washington makes a big thing of in the negotiations and in the conversations, then the question is, how do you sort those out? How do you identify what Washington wants, and how do you identify what China is willing to provide in terms of agreement?
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of those details, if we can, a little bit later in our show. But one of the things, generally speaking, Mr. Tran from D.C., we see the words being used by the Chinese side when they are doing the readouts from the meeting, and also in the pressers given by Chinese State Councilor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, together with Vice Minister of Trade and Commerce Wang Shouwen. They talk about 3 words. To Chinese, as you may know, Mr. Tran, these adjectives are usually very important, even though they could sound abstract, but it's principle in a way. That is mutually beneficial, mutual respect, and reciprocal. Now, earlier there were different words describing the bilateral relations, but now these words have been termed as the 3 I just mentioned. Mr. Tran, how do you see these principles coming from the Chinese side and the U.S.-China working together on drawing up these principles?
Well, essentially, any good and sustainable relationship between sovereign nations have to be based on mutual benefit, mutual respect, and so on. So I think it goes without saying that those are the key for any good relationship. However, the agreement at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires is a welcome step, as many speakers prior to me have stated, in breaking the rising momentum of trade tension, which already has contributed to the slowing down in world trade and a slowing down in the global economy. However, we have to be realistic in the sense that what has been agreed is not much of a ceasefire, but more of a standstill, in the sense that both sides agree not to introduce new tariffs, pending negotiation over a slate of very difficult structural issues over the next 90 days. And as Robert Hormat stated, and I agree with him, those are difficult issues, and if the U.S. insists on a wide, comprehensive interpretation of those things, like level playing field, like open access to markets, like protection of intellectual property and transfer of technology, then the negotiation will be quite challenging.
Professor Liu, there are specific issues that the two sides have to negotiate and work out together. But there are also principled issues that the Chinese always traditionally thinking extremely important. After all, that to the Chinese meaning what is the approach the other side is going to apply in this relationship, and what approach China is willing to apply in this relationship, mainly the nature of this relationship. So I guess there is a little bit cultural difference. But we're not using cultural difference as an excuse not to work out the details, but rather it's important to understand both the principle and the specific issues. So Professor Liu, about that, what is your thought?
I think the between two vast different cultures and a vast different level of governance, so the to set forth this principle is utterly important. For example, mutual respect means no bully. And mutually beneficial means that it has to be a fair trade, and reciprocate meaning that we have to match with the benefit. It's not only, well, you get $1, I get $99. So I think that really is mapping out the basic principles. And also, and the next most important thing is how to define the problem. We always say a problem well defined is a problem half solved. So right now, instead of the tit for tat, at least both sides are getting sober and now sit down to define the problem, recognize the problem, and the next is really how to work out the amiable solution that is satisfactory not only to both sides, but also the whole world are really watching for.
The world is watching. You can think about the stock market today. I mean, 400 points. Have you seen that recently? That is how the world, economic circle is reacting to the U.S.-China trade war. People think this is a relief, at least for now. Mr. Hormats, on the other hand, let me go to you about that too. I mean, you've been working in an administration, so you know this very well, that after an important bilateral meeting, both sides would come out with their own presser and their own list of things that they consider as the most important talking points to the press and to the international, audience. Reading from the two quite intertwined and yet different emphasis lists, given by the two sides. One is the presser coming from the White House. The other is the pressers coming from the Chinese foreign minister and the vice trade minister, and also later the statement coming from China. How do you see this different emphasis about the important talking points, Mr. Hormat?
Well, as you point out, this is normal for summits or any major meeting, and that is each side wants to emphasize the points that it regards as most important, and each side in particular is aiming at its domestic audience, explaining the outcome in ways that it will be able to get domestic support for and good positive resonance on the home front. So it's perfectly understandable that the two sides emphasize different things. What's most important is actually what they in fact have agreed upon in those meetings, and clearly that is important in the major way that it means that each side, if they've agreed on some precise sets of objectives, will then be guided in their negotiations that follow. If there were major differences within the context of the discussions, it's a lot harder for the officials to actually come to an agreement afterwards. And if there are fuzzy areas, it makes it a lot harder for officials to follow up. So my view is that they need to have, as a previous speaker indicated, some context as to where they're going in this relationship. If they've gotten some broad sets of agreements on these follow-up negotiations, that'll be very helpful. If there's still wide differences between the two heads of state, it's going to make it a lot harder for the negotiators at senior level to actually make specific progress.
Beautifully said,
Mr.
Hormat.
That we don't know the answer to.
Thank you for that clarification, because people really need to know how the government works with one another. Having said that, though, one of the different emphasis we have noticed is about trade and negotiation. The U.S. side did mention in its statement coming from the White House about the 90 days. However, the Chinese side, you do notice from top Chinese officials, both the foreign minister and the vice minister of commerce, talk about both sides have agreed that they are working toward the direction of scrapping off the tariffs and through negotiations, and hopefully it will be successful. So you read the words from both sides. Professor Liu, what impressions does it give you?
Well, one is that both sides will have to respect each other instead of dictating terms on the other.
So negotiation, actually, you could tell.
That's right.
That's probably also indicated in the U.S. context as well, because only negotiation could you be able to work out, no matter what the time frame is, right?
Exactly.
That's one thing
right.
you read out.
And
what about the other thing that you can read out?
Identify the common ground that serves really the mutual interest.
So that's the foundation of any negotiation in a way.
That's right. And then, to work out a governance, so that a structured way of negotiation, and also to nail down whatever is agreed instead of repeating over the same dispute.
All right.
Okay. And then also, a roadmap with identified milestones.
Very interesting. Also, you noticed, Mr. Rong, if I go to the geopolitics part, that the Chinese side stated very clearly in its final presser that the U.S. side, that President Trump, recognized the principle of one China. And that is very crucial to China, particularly when it comes to the foundation of U.S.-China relations. To you, what does that say?
Yeah, of course, for the Chinese, and I think for the China and U.S. relationship, the Taiwan issue has always been the most sensitive issues. And that's why I think we find that for almost every meeting, if I can say that, the Chinese side would reiterate its position then, and they would also expect the U.S. side to reiterate its positions of one China policy. And this is for the Chinese, and I think the relationship has always been the political foundation for a stable and healthy relationship. So I think this meeting, as always, is no different.
And meanwhile, Mr. Hormat, inviting your geopolitics expertise also, both sides have mentioned about the DPRK nuclear issue. In different terms, though. And yet they both mentioned this is one of the most important talking points in the bilateral discussion between the two heads of state. Mr. Hormat, what does that say to you?
Well, I think that the key point is that they mentioned it, they, as you say, put a somewhat different emphasis on what they said to the public.
Yes.
But the fact that they raised it suggests to me that there is a desire on the part of both sides to remain engaged with one another on this critical issue. Both sides have somewhat different perspectives on it, but the one thing is very clear, and that is it's going to be very difficult to resolve the issue of a nuclear North Korea if the United States and China are not working together and working at least in parallel directions to deal with this issue. So the fact that it came up is important. What they actually said in the room, I would like to know. The emphasis of coming out is a little bit different, but if they're going to work together and following this up, that's the key thing, because solving it is going to require both sides working together.
Absolutely. Let's go to the questions that all of you raised earlier in the discussion, which is, okay, we have the next short period of time. The two sides have to work out something to be able to report back to their domestic constituency, and also to resolve some of what term as crisis, temporary at least, between China and the United States. So Mr. Cran, what could be the things and the structure and the way to discuss and the way the two sides have to work with one another in order to get that done?
Yes, I think that it is important to recognize that the negotiation has to go beyond strictly commercial issues like reduction of tariffs or importing more goods and services from each other, and go into the way business has been conducted, the practice, particularly as I mentioned before, involving
yeah. I mean, Mr. Tran, I mean, we all know those points. The points have been repeated over and over again. Over the past 20 minutes, both of you have mentioned it many times. But the thing is, through what kind of structure do you think both sides can constructively be able to negotiate and discuss them? Because right now, we understand there are very different views within the administration. I mean, if we talk about the U.S. side, if we talk about Chinese side, there are other challenges. So what structure is the one that we can really pin down the things, let's negotiate, we know who to negotiate to, and who will have the final say? That is the thing. Mr. Tran, is the U.S. ready for that?
Right. Right. So for the next 90 days, I think that the best that we can hope for is two things. One is to identify the issues and to at least come up with some concrete but symbolic gesture to make sure that each side can see there's progress. And more importantly, agreement on a framework that will really allow both sides to negotiate in depth, to look at the detailed implementation measures to deliver those issues. So I think it is a complicated, far-reaching, and not easy to overcome over 90 days, but some progress, if can be made, should be very welcome.
Professor Liu, your thought about that too?
I think, you know, with all the problems identified and recognized, the one very effective way is that you build a steering commission to guide the entire framework, and the rest is really to work out a number of working groups based on different sectors connected with key important issues. Of course, you know, we cannot really solve all the problem within 90 days, but at least we can really prioritize the sequence of solutions and also to bring over, you know, a more convincible and actionable roadmap.
That's the roadmap that you see should happen in the next few months' time. Mr. Hormat, your wisdom here. Under what structure, with what kinds of mechanism can we be able to discuss this thoroughly with the hope that things can be resolved to each other's concerns?
Yes, I think there should be several things. One, I agree with the suggestion there should be high-level working groups to deal with a specific set of issues. You know, the issues may differ, so you may need different experts to deal with different sets of issues. Second, I think that in each one of those, you need one person at the top, in the Chinese delegation and the American delegation, who speaks for the country itself and has direct contact with the leader, because it's important that there be clarity and that each side know that the person they're dealing with on the other side speaks for the head of state of that side. You can't have a lot of instability within delegations and uncertainty as to actually who's speaking for the president. That's, I think, very important. And if you have a lot of voices and the other side doesn't know which voice is authoritative, it's very confusing in a negotiation. The third thing, I think, is to involve, to a greater degree, the business sectors in both countries in these negotiations. Many of them are very technical: intellectual property, trade secrets issues, investment issues, a whole range of issues. And I found coordinating with companies on both sides, Chinese side, American side, is helpful in getting their expertise to help resolve some of these issues. And fourth, some blueprint with some time deadlines on it, because if this gets extended indefinitely, then we're really not going to make any progress. It's not going to be quick, but it can't be sprung out over too long a period of time. Otherwise, I fear, could get back to the kind of problems that we've faced over the last year and a half, with new types of tariffs or other actions that would be very disruptive.
Yeah,
Let me
Professor Liu, very quickly.
One keynote is that empowerment is very important for those negotiation team or working team.
Right, Mr. Rong.
I think for me the sincerity is more important, even though if we don't have that, even a well-structured, framework, as the past experience has shown, we may not, produce the result we are looking for.
The right spirit, the right structure, and the right people at the right time, possibly, gentlemen, we will be able to do something together. But for now, we are running out of time. I hope U.S. and China will not run out of time. for some very big decisions to be made. For now, thank you so much for the four of you for helping us understand the latest situation. Rong Ying, Liu Baocheng, Robert Hormats, and Hong Chuan. Thank you so much for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program. President Xi Jinping in Latin America, the Chinese president's state visit to Argentina and Panama will get you up to speed right now. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program coming to you Monday to Friday, live on CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping is on his trip to Latin America. He arrived in Panama on Monday for his first state visit since the two countries established formal ties. This trip comes after the G20 summit and also a state to Argentina as well. These visits are expected to strengthen cooperation between China and Latin American countries. Let's take a look.
President Xi does the rounds in Latin America. Panamanian President Juan Carlos Varela warmly welcomed the Chinese president in Panama for his first state visit. The two countries established diplomatic ties in June 2017, and last November, Mr. Varela visited Beijing. Earlier, a signed article by President Xi was published in Panama's national newspaper, titled "Working Together for a Shared Future." President Xi hailed Panama's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative and said that they should work toward multilateralism. Last Sunday in Buenos Aires, President Xi and his Argentinian counterpart Mauricio Macri witnessed the signing of more than 30 agreements which covered trade and investments.
We have agreed to a plan with a broader vision, a project of cooperation between China and Argentina that opens a new era in the strategic and integrated relationship between the two countries.
The more China develops and the better China is, the better it will be for Argentina and Argentines, and also for the region and the world.
China is Argentina's second largest trade partner after Brazil and the main importer of Argentinian agricultural commodities, the backbone of its economy. Mr. Xi came amid the ongoing economic turbulence in Argentina. China has offered a $9 billion currency swap deal. The two parties agreed to exchange a certain amount of foreign currencies at a predetermined rate to minimize the impact of fluctuations. In recent years, economic and trade cooperation between China and Latin America has been expanding extensively. According to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, China has become the second largest trading partner of Latin America, while Latin America is ranked second for Chinese overseas investments. In 2017, the trade volume between the two sides was nearly $258 billion, up 18.8% year-on-year. And there is still room for both sides to cooperate.
For more on President Xi Jinping's visit to Latin America in Beijing, we have Jiang Shixue, Vice President of the Chinese Association of Latin American Studies and Professor of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. In Rio de Janeiro, we have Charles Tang, Chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. In Buenos Aires, we have Bruno Binetti, who is a research fellow with the Inter-American Dialogue. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Binetti. Latin American countries, of course, somewhat farther away than most of the countries when it comes to distance with China geographically. However, this time a lot of emphasis on China-Latin America ties. What does that say to you? How much are the two sides needing one another?
Well, yeah, definitely the rise of China as a main economic and diplomatic partner of Latin America has been one of the most substantial transformations in this century for Latin American countries. China is a tremendous trade partner for most countries in Latin America, especially regarding commodities. China is a growing investor in the region, especially in mining, in infrastructure, and now increasingly in more technologically advanced sectors such as telecommunications. And finally, China, perhaps most importantly, has been a tremendous source of financing for infrastructure and other projects for Latin American countries. For the first time, perhaps ever, Latin American countries have a true alternative to U.S. influence in the region, and that's, I think, very remarkable, and that's what this visit shows.
Mr. Tang, trade, investment, infrastructure potential, those are the talking points that Mr. Binetti really want to emphasize about China's role in Latin America. To you, what exactly is it? Because economies vary and therefore very different about its possibility working with China.
Well, in an article I wrote for the World Policy Institute Journal of New
Well, I have some difficulties talking to Mr. Tang. Now, Mr. Jiang, probably you could help us understand from China's perspective. Is that where China wants to emphasize its relations with Latin American countries, trade, investment, infrastructure potential?
Well, I would say the bilateral relationship between the two sides is comprehensive. That means we have cooperation in political fields, economic fields, people-to-people exchanges. But on the whole, I would say it's mainly driven by economic and trade investment. And because China, as you know, China's economy is growing so fast. So we need all kinds of raw materials and commodities, and we can buy these kinds of things from the region. And at the same time, we sell our products to the region, and also we make investment. And that's a kind of a part of the so-called South-South cooperation. And it's not against any third party. It's based on win-win cooperation.
I see. And Mr. Binetti, I mean, earlier there were, during the Cold War time, there were some geopolitical concerns when it comes to China's working relationship with Latin America. But now it seems that we are in a very different stage of time. Mutually beneficial, that's really the word that needs to be mentioned here. Mr. Binetti, when you say so-called alternative to the United States, as you heard Mr. Jiang mention from China, China is not here to replace anybody. But to you, what kinds of possibilities do you have now? But what do you make of these possibilities that Chinese and China could provide in its cooperation with Latin American countries, for example, your country?
Yeah, that's right. Both Argentina and China, I think, have emphasized that this partnership, which started in 2004, is not meant to replace the United States or any other outside power. However, we have been seeing signs from Washington that the U.S. is increasingly nervous about Chinese presence in Latin America in general. We'll see how that evolves based on, as you were discussing in the previous section, about how the U.S.-China relationship evolves in the future. Regarding Argentina in particular, as you mentioned before, we are experiencing economic turbulences, financial instability, a recession. So China's financial backing, Chinese purchase of more Argentine products, those are priorities for the Argentine government. And the Argentine government will try to, I think, promote relations with China, with the United States, and with any other country that can increase and boost trade and investment ties with Argentina.
Right. Mr. Tang, as you can see, Mr. Binetti is trying to emphasize on this model of South-South cooperation. To you, how much is that coming into the scene between China and Latin American countries?
I think the relationship between China and Latin America is of utmost importance. In an article I wrote for the World Policy Institute Journal, I alluded to the fact that the U.S. backyard is really growing a Chinese garden because the U.S. neglected Latin America for a long time, and China invested massively, helped Brazil during the worst time of its economic crisis, like it's helping Argentina now in Argentinians' economic crisis, and also building a tremendous amount of infrastructure, which is the basis of development and prosperity. In the same way that China transformed Africa from a lost continent to a continent of hope by investing massively in the infrastructure of the continent.
Mr. Jiang.
So it's crucial for all of Latin America.
Thank you, sir. But Mr. Jiang, when I was listening to Mr. Tang, I'm not sure whether China alone will be able to transform the continent of Africa from one thing into totally a different thing. But rather, this is a mutually beneficial relationship, if I understand right. Therefore, Mr. Jiang, the question is, whether China likes it or not, whether China believes it or not, Africa's going to shape it as if it is China vis-a-vis the United States in competition or in cooperation, in whichever issues from now on, it seems. And therefore, what can China do in this regard?
Well, as you know, that China is now the second biggest economy, but still it's a developing country. It has lots of domestic issues to deal with. So I would say China is not able to do everything for Africa, for Latin America, to deal with its poverty issues and other kinds of things. But China can offer a helping hand. And as Charles Tang mentioned, let's say, suppose the region can be China's garden, then this kind of garden can benefit the U.S. That kind of garden will follow beautiful flowers that will reduce illegal drug trafficking. Then it will reduce illegal migration. So that's in the interests of the U.S.
I do like the garden. I like that analogy rather. Mr. Binetti, can 100 flowers blossom in that garden at the same time?
That's the key. I think the first thing the U.S. should understand is that Latin America is probably not anybody's backyard anymore. The region is experiencing some problems now, but has grown significantly in the past few years, thanks in no small part to ties with China. I think just as the U.S. is changing, adapting its policy to a more plural world, it also needs to understand that it is no longer the only outside power with a presence in Latin America. The American countries would like to continue having good relations with the United States, with China, with Europe, and with all powers. So the key will be to perhaps include a discussion about how both countries can coexist in Latin America within U.S.-China talks. Latin America, in that sense, can become a focus of tension between the two countries, and it would be important to diffuse those.
Okay, Mr. Tan, so here comes the thing. Pragmatically, what can China and Latin American economies do together? I mean, now, as we all know, there are some difficulties both in the financial sector and also in the trade sector for the region of Latin America and for China as well in terms of its negotiation with the United States. So is there some pragmatic common ground that both sides can work together, particularly the fact that Latin America, geographically speaking, is still quite far away from China? Cut the cost to be able to mutually beneficial make that tie economic between the two sides. That is crucial, Mr. Tan.
I think that Latin America is a strategic partner for China because China needs access to the strategic resources for its continuous development and also for the food security of the Chinese people. The recent trade war between the United States and China has benefited Brazil and Argentina and other food producers who are substituting the food supplies from the United States to China. Of course, with this very important agreement of holding it off for 90 days, which is a short period of time, I think that United States farmers will start being able to export their products again. The strategic relationship between Latin America and China does not mean it has to exclude the United States. The superpower rivalry did not start with Trump, will not end with Trump, but it's important and crucial that both superpowers can work together for the benefit of the whole world and for mankind.
It is very crucial, and they have the responsibilities. Mr. Jiang.
Yeah. Well, 2 years ago, China published its second policy paper towards Latin America. And in this very important policy paper, we can see that there is one paragraph which is called third-party cooperation. That means China wants to cooperate with somebody else to work in Latin America. And the third party can be the U.S., can be Japan, can be Europe. So now we are talking about China, U.S., Latin America. So I would say let's have a triangulation, U.S., Latin America, and China. So if that kind of triangulation can be established, then that will be win-win-win for the triple sides.
As long as all parties are willing to do that. For now, we are running out of time. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us both in China and from Brazil and Argentina, Jiang Xueshi, as well as our guest from Latin America, Bruno Binetti, Charlestown. Thank you for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight, CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.